Okay, thank you. So we'll follow the same format as yesterday. We'll have 2 presentations, and then if everyone's good and we finish on time, you can have half an hour for a cup of coffee, and then we'll come back for the 3rd session. So our first speaker this morning is Dragomir Dimitrov from the University of Marburg, who's going to talk to us about one of the core members of the group, actually, someone who's been with us right from the start. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like just to say many thanks to Igal and David and all the other colleagues and friends involved with the organization of this unique conference. Yesterday we ended with a short note on Virode in Tamil, and now I'm happy to move to Sri Lanka with a talk which perhaps also involves a kind of Virode, which Dande would have perhaps classified as Agama Virode. So I'm going to speak about the dual mind and the extent of his contributions to the studies of the Kavyadarsa. And since Ratna, as I prefer to refer to the dual mind for short, has accompanied me for more or less half of my life, you'll forgive me if I start with a short autobiographical digression. My first encounter with this Sinhalese scholar of the 10th century took place on one summer morning in 1997 in the German city of Marburg, when my teacher, Professor Michael Hahn, presented to me a palm leaf manuscript of a work which was written by Ratna. This was at a time when I didn't have any idea of the extent and versatility of Ratna's works, and very little was known about him to me. My daily meetings with Ratna came to some fruition first in 1999, when I completed a critical edition and a study of the first chapter, both in Sanskrit and in Tibetan. And this was my MA thesis, which I published in 2002, when I was already engaged with the 3rd chapter of the Kavyadarsa. The work on the 3rd chapter included also a new edition of the corresponding part of Ratna's Ratnashritika and an editio princeps of Panklodzava's Panktika, as well as other paraphernalia, including a chapter on Ratna, with all the information about him known to me at that time. This formed my PhD thesis, which I submitted to the University of Marburg in 2004, and I published it as a book in 2011. When I completed this tiresome, tedious, painstaking work, as Richard Lariviere has once eloquently described, the unpleasant and unattractive process of editing texts, I thought that after spending countless hours with Ratna, it would be better to part company with him, at least for some time. I could not imagine then that my work on his Ratnashritika was only the beginning of a much close and enduring relationship with this author, which will even bring me to Jerusalem. Now, besides to Igal and David, I'm partly in debt for this trip to Sheldon Pollock, who unintentionally contributed to reinvigorating my interest in Ratna by publishing in 2005 an article about him. Since our conclusions considerably differ, I decided to write a short reply to Pollock's Ratnashijñana, which against my initial expectation gradually took the form of a voluminous book. And since this book, entitled The Legacy of the Dual Mind, should be published very soon, and there is no time to go into any detail here, I will only briefly mention the main points of difference. Pollock's main thesis, reiterated in his language of the gods and the world of men, is that Ratnashijñana wrote at the Rashtrakuta court of Krishna III, a king of the imperial Rashtrakutas of Karnataka, with whom Pollock tried to identify Ratna's patron, King Tunga, mentioned both in the conclusion of the Ratnashritika and in the colophon of the Border Inscription of Tunga Dharmavaloka. In the concluding part of the Ratnashritika, however, one rather finds an account of a feudatory king, of the Rashtrakuta family, and all surpassing ornament of the Rashtrakuta, and the head jewel of the Vasus. And not a supreme lord, he was just a ruler of men, a Nara Adipa, and not a supreme lord, a Paramabhattaraka. He wasn't a great king of kings, Maharaja, Adhiraja, and so on, as Krishna III is usually described. Tunga Dharmavaloka's feudatory status is corroborated by the fact that the Ratnashitika is dated in the 23rd regnal year of King Rajapala. Moreover, the argument that, I quote Pollock, the fact that Ratnashri calculates Tunga's date according to regnal years conforms with Krishna III's own practice is invalid, since the Bodh Gaya inscription contains rather the date of Tunga's suzerain, who, I think, was the same Pala king, during whose reign Ratna completed his commentary on the Kavyadarsa 8 years later. In other words, both the Bodh Gaya inscription and the Ratnashitika were written at the court of a Rashtrakuta feudatory who belonged to the so-called Bodh Gaya branch of the Rashtrakutas. Pollock's assertion that we have no information from elsewhere corroborating the existence of such a family is fortunately incorrect, for besides the two references to such a family in Ratna's own works, an account of the matrimonial alliance of King Rajapala with Bhagyadevi, the daughter of the high-crowned Tunga, the moon of the Rashtrakuta family, also refers to the same branch of the Rashtrakutas. In addition, the name Dharmavaloka is also attested as an epithet of King Nanyadeva, the founder of the Karnataka kingdom in Mithila, who lived approximately 200 years after Tunga Dharmavaloka, and who might be a scion of the same Bodh Gaya branch of the Rashtrakutas. With regard to the three rulers mentioned in the Bodh Gaya inscription, namely Tunga's father Kirtiraja, his grandfather Nannagunavaloka, and Tunga Dharmavaloka himself, Pollock opined that it is not at all clear how strictly we are to take Ratnashri's genealogy. There is, however, no compelling reason to cast doubt on the strictness of this genealogy, and even if one would question its veracity, still other insoluble difficulties would remain. Pollock's identification of Nannagunavaloka with the imperial Rashtrakuta king Nripatunga Amogavarsha is tentative and does not explain the discrepant names and epithets. Moreover, none of the Rashtrakuta rulers who have reigned in the time between Nripatunga Amogavarsha and Krishna III can be credibly identified with Kirtiraja, the second ruler mentioned in the conspicuously short genealogy of the Bodh Gaya inscription. For these and several other reasons, I do not see how the idea that the author of the Ratnashitika was patronized by Krishna III and attended the Rashtrakuta court of the Deccan can be maintained. On the other hand, there is every reason to believe that the Sinhalese scholar Ratnashijnana was patronized by a Rashtrakuta vassal of Rajapala in northern India and was supported by him during an extended period of at least 8 years. When attempting to settle the question of Ratnashijnana's place and date, it is advantageous to consider the very name under which this scholar has composed and actually even signed 3 of his Sanskrit works, namely the panegyric in the Bodh Gaya inscription, the Shabdartha Chinta, and the Ratnashitika, in whose colophons Ratnashijnana is explicitly mentioned as their author. Particularly important is to pay attention to the second part of this name, that is to say, to the element Srijnana, which is only one of several similar suffixes attached to the names of many Buddhist monks in northern India. We know, moreover, that sometimes different suffixes were attached to the one and the same proper name of a single person, as for example in the case of Dipamkara Srijnana, who is identical with Dipamkara Rakshita and possibly also with Dipamkara Kirti, and who besides this, in his childhood, which he spent at least for some time at the Samapura Mahavihara, was first called Chandragarbha and was later given the secret initiation name of Jnana Guha Vajra, and he became best known, of course, under the name of Atisha. Dipamkara Srijnana and all the other Srijnanas known to us, such as Buddha Srijnana, Samgama Srijnana, Ravi Srijnana, Narendra Srijnana, and Pandita Srijnana, were all Buddhists whom the records associate in one way or another with monasteries in Magadha, in particular with Vikramashila and Vajrasana. This fact clearly suggests that the Sinhalese Ratnashijnana too is to be localized in the same region, and not in the Deccan or elsewhere. Another tiny detail to be noticed in the Border Inscription of Tunga Dharmavaloka, points in the same direction. In the colophon of this epigraph, the author is referred to as Pandita, which is not an academic or a monastic title, but rather an official title which the Pala kings used to bestow on senior scholars affiliated with the Buddhist monastic centers in Magadha. Hence, on this basis too, it seems justified to conclude that Ratna Shishnyana was active for several years in northern India. Now, from the available outlines of medieval Indian literature, one may get the impression that there were at least 3 Ratnas. Thus, Ratna Shishnyana, whom I will call here Ratna II in the middle, is preceded by one Ratna Madhu, so Ratna I, who, just like Ratna II, was a Buddhist born in Lanka. The 2 Ratnas were well versed in Sanskrit and certainly lived sometime after Dandin and before the 12th century. Both Ratna I and Ratna II specialized in the field of poetic art, with special emphasis on Dandin's Kavyadarsa. Ratna II stayed in the middle of the 10th century in northern India, but sooner or later his commentary on the Kavyadarsa must have reached Lanka, for it was used for the purposes of the Kavyadarsa Sanaya, certainly before the end of the 12th century. Besides being an expert on Sanskrit poetic theory, Ratna II was also a grammarian versed in the Chandravyakarana. Not unlike the Ratna Shitika, the Shabdartha Chinta too must have been brought to Lanka hardly any later than the 12th century, since several Sinhalese experts on grammar who lived at that time quote from it. The 2 Sinhalese Ratnas are joined by a 3rd one, namely a certain Ratnamati, or Ratna III, who wrote the Chandravyakarana Panjika, an extensive commentary on the Chandravritti, not later than the end of the 11th century. Similarly to his partial namesakes, this Ratnamati of unspecified origin was obviously well versed in Sanskrit. Moreover, exactly like Ratna II, he was profoundly acquainted with the Chandra school of grammar. Like his partial namesakes, Ratna III was a Buddhist scholar, and his work was extensively studied in Lanka, since the 12th century at the latest. The Chandravyakarana Panjika was also well known in northern India, since no later than the 12th century, and his name appears in Tibetan works since around the same time. Taking into consideration only this basic data, it can be summarized that apart from having partially identical names, the 3 Ratnas were also co-religionists, and their works were studied in Lanka at approximately the same time. Ratna I and the II shared the common interest in Sanskrit poetry, and Ratna II and the III were both Sanskrit grammarians. Apart from this, Ratna I and the II shared a common place of origin. When it is understood that the name of Ratna Madhu is in all likelihood only a distorted form of Ratnamati, or in other words, Ratna I and Ratna III are the same person, as I will show you in a minute, and when furthermore it is borne in mind that Ratna II, who evidently matches Ratna I in all respects, could have acquired the Shrijnana suffix of his name only during his stay in northern India, it becomes crystal clear that we're dealing here with the works by a single Buddhist scholar. Well, a Jew mind born in Lanka towards the beginning of the 10th century, who spent about a decade of his life in northern India. The identity of Ratnamati and Ratna Shishnyana is not at all a new idea, for speculations about this were expressed more than a century ago by 2 great Sinhalese scholars, Ratnamalane Dharmakirti Dharmarama and Don Martino de Silva Vikramasinghe. Towards the end of the 20th century, after some additional information about the date of the grammarian Ratnamati had been collected, the likelihood of the suggested identity grew, but even then everything remained within the sphere of unproven probabilities and possibilities. There have been various obstacles making it difficult to prove this hypothesis satisfactorily. A major impediment has been the confusion concerning the date of the Siyabaslakara and its paraphrase, and especially the fact that since Hendrik Jayatilaka's Editio Prinkist, published in 1892, it has been accepted universally that the Sinhalese paraphrase was authored by a scholar called Ruvan-Mi in Sinhalese or Ratnamadhu in Sanskrit, about whom nothing else was known. He is mentioned only once after the end of the Siyabaslakara itself in a colophon which makes which marks the end of the paraphrase. The colophon consists of 2 stanzas, which the commentator has composed in the same style as the main work, and which apparently he himself has furnished with a paraphrase. Since 1892, the correctness of the name Ratna Madhu as a Sanskrit equivalent of Sinhalese Ruvan Mi has been accepted unreservedly, probably because at first sight everything seems to fit quite neatly. Sinhalese Ruvan is the regular equivalent of Sanskrit Ratna, and Sinhalese Mi corresponds to Sanskrit Madhu. In the Sanskrit literature, however, the odd name of Ratna Madhu, which we can translate like jewel honey or honey of jewel, does not occur anywhere, probably because an author by this name has never existed. It has possibly come into existence only thanks to a misreading of one single akshara in Ratnamadhya Acharyan instead of Ratnamatya Acharyan. Or alternatively, it resulted from a later misleading translation into Sanskrit of the Sinhalese form Ruvan Mi. 3 manuscripts of the Siyabhaslakara Sannaya consulted by me do not contain any evidence in favor of the name Ratna Madhu. It seems quite likely that Jayatilaka had at his disposal similar codices, and this casts even more doubt on the trustworthiness of the paraphrase of the final 2 stanzas, and in particular on the veracity of the reading Ratnamadhvacharyan. At present, we cannot even be sure whether this paraphrase was written by Ruvan Mi himself, or it was possibly contributed much later, perhaps by the first modern editor of the text. The explanation for the error is in fact quite simple. If one only bears in mind that Sinhalese Mi is the equivalent not only of Sanskrit Madhu, but also of a number of other Sanskrit words. This is well known in the case of Sanskrit Mahi, Mahisha, Mushika, and Mritya or Mrityu. To this, Sanskrit Mati should also be added, in my opinion, even though the dictionaries do not record Mi in this meaning. Similar Sinhalese Tadbhava words such as Gi for Sanskrit Gati and especially Ri for Sanskrit Rati make it evident that Sinhalese Mi can be a regular development of Sanskrit Mati. Now, it becomes clear that the ambiguity of the Sinhalese word may have misled the copyist who, while thinking of its most common meaning honey, Madhu, could have written Ratnamadhvacharyan instead of Ratnamatyacharyan. The possibility also remains, however, that Ratna Madhu is a wrong Sanskrit translation, which came to the mind of some later scholar or the modern editor, who may have thought of it as the closest equivalent of the Sinhalese form, Ruvan Mi. Either way, it is quite certain that Ratna Madhu is not an authentic name, but rather the result of some sort of misunderstanding, whereas there can be no doubt that Ruvan Mi represents the Sinhalese form or Tadbhava of the Sanskrit name Ratnamati, as Pollock has also suggested briefly in the final paragraph of his aforementioned article. In short, despite the inferior reading in all modern editions and its ubiquitousness in the secondary literature, we may now take it for granted that Ruvan Mi is the very same person as Ratnamati, who is best known for his commentary on the Chandravyakarana. The realization that it was the Sinhalese grammarian Ratnamati who composed the Siyabhaslakara Sannaya only shortly after, or perhaps even in the course of the preparation of the core treatise on Sinhalese poetics, namely the Siyabhaslakara, which tradition attributes to King Salamavan, whom I suggest to identify with King Kassapa V, is of key importance. It makes the hypothesis of the identity of the Sinhalese literary critic and the grammarian Ratnamati with his contemporaneous Sinhalese specialist on Sanskrit poetics and grammar Ratna Shishnyana not only likely, but also unavoidable. This lets us understand that the Jaw mind has composed works both in Sanskrit and Sinhalese, whose relative chronology, moreover, it is possible to reconstruct. Thus, it seems now justified to assume that after completing his paraphrase on the Siyabhaslakara, probably in the early 920s, Ratnamati worked on his Chandravyakarana Panchika, presumably sometime in the 920s, 930s, after which, in the early 940s, he went to northern India, where he acquired the name of Ratna Shishnyana. There, the Sinhalese scholar composed the Border Inscription in 944, wrote the Shabdartha Chinta and an auto-commentary on it, most likely sometime in the 940s, penned a collection of nice Sanskrit verses, and finished his Ratna Shitika in 952 before returning to his homeland. Back in Lanka, after renewed ordination, its reinforcement on another similar procedure, this scholar continued his career under the name of Upatissa. It is in this third stage of his long and prodigious career that he wrote his major works in Pali and several more texts in Sinhalese. Now, since a discussion of the authorship and date of the 10 texts which I assigned to this period of Ratna's literary activities is impossible here, I will note only that his contribution to the study of Dandi's Kavyadarsa seems to extend beyond the Siyabaslakara Sannaya and the Ratna Shaitika, and I feel inclined to attribute to the same scholar the anonymous Sinhalese word-for-word translation of the Kavyadarsa, namely the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, or Dandya Alankara Sanni, as this text is referred in the secondary literature in the rare cases when it is mentioned at all. The few authorities such as Goda Kumbura and Behat, who in their studies of Sinhalese literature have briefly noted this anonymous work, have tentatively dated it to the 12th or 13th century. Until now, this date has mostly remained unchallenged, or still later date, for example the 15th century, has been suggested. The main reason for not considering an early date and for not reckoning with the possibility of Ratna's authorship is that it has not been recognized that the editio princeps of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, which Ratna Malane Dharmakirti Dharmarama initiated and his pupil Dharma Ananda brought to completion in 1925, does not reproduce faithfully the original text and is heterogeneous. It proves to be in fact a patchwork, indebted in part to two modern Sanskrit commentaries published in Calcutta in 1863 and 1882. That the available edition of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya has been tampered is both surprising and undeniable. In their preface, the editors mentioned that, I quote, "a few old palm leaf manuscripts have been utilized and corrected." But even this note and their brief reference to two modern Sanskrit commentaries on the Kavyadarsa by Premachandra Tarkavagisha and Jivananda Vidyasagara hardly let the user suspect how untrustworthy this edition actually is, and hence how faulty any conclusions concerning the date and author of the text are destined to be if one relies solely on it. A closer look at the published text reveals that from the beginning up to stanza 3, 158, the Sanskrit version in the Sinhalese work matches consistently the text of the Kavyadarsa as commented upon in the Ratna Shaitika. Wherever in this larger part of the work the old Sanskrit commentary and the modern Calcutta scholar disagree with regard to the wording of the Kavyadarsa, the Sinhalese text agrees, with only few exceptions, with the version read by Ratna. From 3, 159 up to the end, that is in the section covering the final 29 stanzas of the Kavyadarsa, the Sinhalese paraphrase always tallies with the modern scholia, wherever the Ratna Shaitika and the modern Calcutta commentaries reflect a different root text. This flagrant incongruity can be explained easily. The first larger portion of the text was more or less faithfully edited on the basis of some Sinhalese manuscripts and contains the authentic work of a medieval Sinhalese master. Yet the second portion was not written by this scholar and is certainly not old, for it represents a modern composition which Dharma Ananda prepared largely under the influence of Vidyasagara's Sanskrit commentary written in the second half of the 19th century. Even a cursory look will suffice to realize that the printed version of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya contains a partial Sinhalese translation of Vidyasagara's comments. Now, for example, in the commentary on 3, 165, the Sinhalese explanation clearly represents a precise rendering of Vidyasagara's words in Sanskrit. Many other similar examples could be easily given, but I think that's not necessary here. It is more important to stress that the influence of the modern Calcutta commentaries can be recognized not only in this evidently modern part of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, but also in the portion which, by and large, was written by the old Sinhalese author. Such silent interpolations and modifications can be particularly misleading. For example, in the printed edition of the Sannaya on Kavyadarsa 3, 158, Kedara Bhatta's definition of the Upendra Vajra meter from his Vritta Ratnakara is to be read exactly as in the Calcutta commentaries. The manuscripts of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya prove, however, that the Sinhalese author has quoted the somewhat different definition from Jayadeva Chandas. In other words, the date of Kedara Bhatta, perhaps 11th, 12th century, is irrelevant, and it is the date of the Jayadeva Chandas which provides the terminus postquem for the Sinhalese paraphrase. Since in the early second half of the 10th century Jayadeva's work was certainly well known, this quotation does not preclude a date in the 10th century for the Kavyadarsa Sannaya itself. Another foreign body in the Sinhalese paraphrase is half a stanza from Purushottama Deva's Haravali. This quotation, in which synonyms of Gandharva Hasta or the Iranda tree are mentioned, can also be read in the Kakuta commentaries. And it has certainly been introduced into the Sinhalese edition directly from there. Most likely, the codices used by the Sinhalese editor had a lacuna at this place, and he tried to fill it up by silently borrowing and translating material from the modern Sanskrit commentaries. Obviously, neither the quotation of the 12th century Vritaratnakara nor of the Haravali, nor any of these portions of the edition of the Kavyadarsa which have been written centuries after the original work itself provide a sound reason to date the text in the 12th or 13th century. Charles Hallisey noted in one of his talks given here in Jerusalem, I think in October, that in the Kavyadarsa Sannaya there is a significant overlap with Ratnashitika. Now, for a long time, this fact seems to have been either unknown or not paid enough attention. And this is quite crucial, since the realization of the specific relationship between the two texts allows us to raise a plausible hypothesis for the date and authorship of the Sinhalese paraphrase. There is indeed plenty of evidence for the close relation between Ratnas Ratnashitika and the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, whose author must have been extremely well acquainted with the Sanskrit commentary and felt at ease adopting comments, examples, and references from it. A few examples will suffice to show this here. So I provide now an illustration for the overlap. In the comments on Kavyadarsa 131, both texts share the same note on Champu Kavya. In the comments on Kavyadarsa 134, both works contain the same reference to Pravarasena. In the context of Maharashtra, in the same stanza, again, both works mention the people of Kuntala and Murala, and the explanation on Prakrishtam Prakritam is almost identical. Even more remarkable is the fact that both in the Ratnashitika and in the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, the same example of a benediction in Sanskrit is given, the first two lines of which Ratna had originally composed for the sake of the Border Inscription of Tunga Dharmavaloka. The Sanskrit commentary and the Sinhalese paraphrase also share the same example of a salutation, Namaskriya. And both texts similarly exemplify an indication of the theme, Vastu Nirdesha, by means of Shishupalabhada 1.1. However, interestingly, in the Ratnashitika, the commentator has quoted only the first three words of the stanza in the articulated assumption that the rest of it is well known to his Sanskrit readers, ityadih prasiddha eva. Whereas in the Sinhalese work, it is given in full, which is certainly more suitable and user-friendly in a book intended for Sinhalese readership. After the Sinhalese paraphrase of 148 and 149, the very same three stanzas have been provided in Sanskrit, which Ratna has presented and actually co-authored first in his Ratnashitika. After the paraphrase of 366, the Sinhalese work supplies a large continuous portion in Sanskrit, which was evidently borrowed, with only a few omissions, from the Ratnashitika. Such extensive borrowings from the Sanskrit text have been deemed necessary, especially in the case of Dandin's complicated examples in the 3rd chapter of his treatise. Thus, besides the previous example, the Kavyadarsa Sannaya includes a large number of pratikas and the corresponding comments in Sanskrit on at least 15 more stanzas. Now, besides all this, exactly like in the Ratnashitika on Kavyadarsa 3.137, the Sinhalese paraphrase also contains the quotation of Haribhadra's Abhisamaya Alamkara Aloka. Quite remarkably, in a few other cases, again closely following the Ratnashitika, the Sinhalese work reports and explains the same varia lectiones in the Sanskrit text of the Kavyadarsa, which Ratna has also discussed in his own commentary. Finally, more than once, the concluding explanatory notes which sometimes appear after the Sinhalese paraphrase can be recognized as literal translations of the corresponding Sanskrit comments in the Ratnashitika. The agreement between Ratna's Sanskrit commentary on the Kavyadarsa and its Sinhalese paraphrase is so conspicuous, and their common elements so numerous, that only two explanations for this peculiar situation seem possible. The explanation which until now those scholars who dated the Kavyadarsa Sannaya in the 12th century or later would have assumed is that someone who lived at least 2 centuries after Ratna and knew his Ratnashitika very well has incorporated silently into his own work various parts of the Sanskrit commentary in various ways. In other words, they would be forced to posit a case of a specific plagiarism. The alternative explanation is that the Sinhalese paraphrase was prepared by Ratna himself. That is to say, by the same author who completed in 952 the Ratnashitika, and in the early 920s wrote the Sinhalese paraphrase of the Siyabhaslakara, if not the main work itself too. The common elements could then be explained with what I call authorial reuse, which can be also observed in some of Ratna's other works, as we already saw. Now, I would like to mention briefly at least 3 reasons why the assumption of plagiarism seems to me, in this case, unlikely and unnecessary, whereas the hypothesis of a characteristic authorial reuse appears to explain most plausibly and satisfactorily the textual evidence. First, the advocates of plagiarism will have to acknowledge that there remains not a single compelling argument in favor of a considerable time gap between the Ratnashitika and the Kavyadarsa Sannaya. As I showed to you, several arguments which one could have possibly raised in order to support the late post-11th century date for the Sinhalese work proved to be based on evidence written in the last quarter of the 19th and the first quarter of the 20th century. Second, the nature of textual reuse in this text hardly fits to the usual pattern of unacknowledged reworking of other people's material, as we often observe it in the later Sinhalese and Pali literature. For example, in Samgarakita's Mahasamitika on his own Subodha Alamkara. In the latter work, nearly 60 stanzas from Dandin's treatise have been translated more or less faithfully, and in almost all these cases, in his commentary on these stanzas, Samgarakita has translated in Pali, en bloc, and without acknowledgement, a significant number of Sanskrit explanations which he read in the Ratnashitika. In the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, on the other hand, the author has proceeded in a very selective manner, choosing only particular bits, sometimes translating them into Sinhalese, at other times providing them directly in Sanskrit, supplying at least in one case the entire Sanskrit text of a stanza quoted only partially in the Sanskrit commentary, opting to report in some cases even variant readings which hardly any normal plagiator or later reuser would have thought worth bothering with. This emancipated approach towards the Ratnashitika is quite different from the rather unpretentious way Samgarakita has reused the same text. Third, in the case of plagiarism, we would have expected the entire Kavyadarsa Sannaya to bear the same characteristics up to the very end of the text. Since the Editio Princeps does not contain the genuine final part of the Sinhalese paraphrase, however, it cannot be immediately realized that the work on the last 29 stanzas of the Kavyadarsa has actually been left in a very peculiar, unfinished state, which would have been least expected if it were the product of a plagiator. The modern edition of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya is, as I mentioned, a patchwork, which resulted from the editor's wish to present a complete text, since the manuscripts on which it is based were deficient and did not preserve it in its entirety. I am aware of 2 such codices in London, which are both complete physically, but incomplete with regard to the text handed down in them, since they end abruptly at the same place after the first pada of Kavyadarsa 3.159. That is exactly where the modern edition suddenly starts following the Calcutta commentaries against the evidence of the Ratnashitika. There is, however, a third comparatively old manuscript of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya, written in 1779, and kept now in Copenhagen, which helps us to check the matter more reliably and lets us decide more confidently whether plagiarism or authorial reuse is likelier. The last folio of this codex is particularly remarkable because, on the one hand, it confirms that in the case of Kavyadarsa 3.158, the Sinhalese treatise exceptionally, and indeed quite surprisingly, does not contain a paraphrase of the Sanskrit text and provides instead only a comment on it in Sinhalese. partly based on the Ratnashitika. On the other hand, unlike the London manuscripts, this last folio of the Copenhagen Codex does preserve the entire text up to the end of Dundan's treatise, but as in the case of 3,158, the remaining stanzas, which here agree with Ratna's text, have also been left without a Sinhalese paraphrase. And only to 6 of them, very brief notes in Sanskrit have been added. The same remarks can also be found with 2 small variations at the end of the detailed commentary on these stanzas in the Ratnashitika. One is missing because it's over here. The fact that the Copenhagen Codex does preserve the complete Kavyadarsa in Sanskrit, though without the paraphrase of the last 29 stanzas, shows that the lack of the Sinhalese text cannot simply be explained with the loss of a certain number of folios in some old manuscript of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya. For such a disruption would have necessarily affected the root text too. It rather indicates that its author has deliberately refrained from paraphrasing the Sanskrit text after Kavyadarsa 3,157. Moreover, the final remark, Artaya Sugamai, the meaning is clear, at the end of his comment on 3,158, may easily be interpreted as an admission that for some unspecified reason the author was not able to elaborate further. It can be only speculated why exactly the Sinhalese work has been left in this unfinished or rather incomplete state. It is important to stress in any case that such an approach could be hardly expected if a plagiator has been at work here with a complete Ratnashitika being at his disposal. Since Ratna himself has exhaustively studied the Kavyadarsa and not only composed a detailed commentary on it in Sanskrit during his stay in northern India when he was known as Ratnashijñana, but also wrote a Sinhalese paraphrase on the Sriyabaslakara when he was still called Ratnamati, his authorship of the Sinhalese translation of Dundan's treatise appears to be the most logical consequence of his studies in the field of poetics. It thus seems quite natural that this outstanding scholar has prepared a translation of the Kavyadarsa in his native language, furnishing it with notes, thereby drawing out of convenience upon his earlier works on the same topic. It is impossible to establish when exactly Ratna has worked on the Kavyadarsa for the last time, but I suspect that this could have been still in the early 950s, perhaps only shortly after his return from northern India. This contribution to the study of Dundan's mirror may well mark the end of the second and the beginning of the third major period of Ratna's creative biography, when under the name of Upatissa he dedicated himself mostly to the composition of texts in Pali. Most of these later works have been handed down anonymously, and Ratna has never been considered as their possible author. Yet I believe to have found enough arguments which justify the risk of regarding them as part of the legacy of the dual mind. Until now, many of Ratna's works in Sinhalese, Sanskrit and Pali have appeared to us as pieces of a large jigsaw puzzle scattered around. After analyzing closely those compositions which were indubitably written by Ratna, such as the Bodh inscription and the Ratnashitika, the Chandravyakarana Panjika, the Shabdartha Chinta and his auto commentary, it became clear to me that it is possible to reassemble and attribute to the same author several more pieces which fit neatly together, such as the Sriyabaslakara Sannaya, the Kavyadarsa and the Kavyadarsa Sannaya. And believe it or not, I think more than 10 other works. Well, it is furthermore possible to date some of these texts quite precisely, whereas for some of them only an approximate date can be suggested, as shown in the timeline which you have as a handout. And with this, I would like now to bring my talk to an end. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions, just 20 minutes. Dragomir, I'll let you choose
Sure, yeah.
because you know people better than I
Yep.
do. And I'll just give the microphone your...
Andrew, yeah.
So,
I think Andrew was the first for myself. Andrew. Yeah.
Hi. So why did the author of the Kavyadarsa Sannaya not finish it?
Well, it seems to me that after 3,157, he didn't have time to work further on it and to paraphrase in Sinhalese the text, because until including 3.157, we have always a Sinhalese paraphrase. So each word of the Sanskrit text is paraphrased individually, and then from time to time some further comments are contributed. And starting from 3.158, we don't have any such paraphrases. We have a fairly extensive comment on 3.158, and then only a few more Sanskrit comments basically on the remaining stanzas. And this last note, Artaya Sugamai, which I thought it could have been really. I'm sorry. Well, the rest it's easy. You can read in my Ratna Shaitika. I don't have time for this. I have more urgent projects, and he worked then on really quite extensive works, which is another matter.
I'm going to follow up on Andrew's question. I mean, isn't it at least as likely then that the testimony of these manuscripts you mentioned from London is actually the authentic testimony, and the text actually just breaks off there, and that the Copenhagen manuscript is itself a patch up, something like what you see in the edition, when they're just when it's either synthesizing an earlier manuscript of the Kavyadarsa or someone just writing it out.
Clearly not.
It's just in Sanskrit from that point in the text.
Clearly not. That's not the case. It's pretty
why?
certain. Yes. Now we have two London manuscripts, and they're complete physically, as I mentioned, and they end, or at least one of them ends in the middle of the folio, and then we have the Mangalamastu, something like this. So it's clear that the scribe didn't have anything more, and it ends abruptly in the middle of 3.159. Now, these are the two manuscripts in London. The codex in Copenhagen, which you saw on the slide, is quite different. It's older, first of all, and it contains the entire root text, which is only with a few more comments in Sanskrit. And if you compare it with the London manuscripts, you can easily see that it fits on one single folio. So I guess that the London manuscripts were based on a previous copy, in which one single folio at the end was missing. And then all the textual evidence, we do have a complete root text of the Kavyadarsa in the Copenhagen manuscript, and it fits almost completely with the text commented in the Ratna Shaitika, whereas, of course, the Kavyadarsa Sanaya edition is quite modern in this part of the text. So it's quite clear that we cannot assume that the Copenhagen manuscript has been somehow patched.
I don't mean that it itself was patched up necessarily, but its ancestor may have been. So imagine a thematic tree. You have the point where you have the loss of the material. That gets transmitted through however many intervening steps, and you end up with the London manuscripts, where it actually marks the end of the text as such, where the physical text ended. Then you have a manuscript here, the ancestor of the Copenhagen manuscript, where it gets filled out with it. This is just a hypothesis, but it gets filled out with additional material from over here. It gets contaminated from a Kavyadarsa manuscript in Sanskrit.
I don't see any reason why I should assume such a convoluted way to explain.
Is that very convoluted? Maybe my explanation was convoluted. I don't think that the situation doesn't sound that convoluted to me. I mean, it's just the difference between the London manuscripts transmitting the truth and this one transmitting the truth.
I can't see anything which would anything compelling to think in this direction. Why should we explain the textual evidence like this when we have a consistent root text, and we have the case already at the end of 3.158 that there is no Sinhalese paraphrase, and we see what has happened.
But if I understand, I'll give up after this. If I understood you correctly, then, I mean, in any case, no matter what, there's an anomaly that occurs at 158, right?
Yes. The anomaly is that the Sinhalese, that the Sanskrit text has not been paraphrased up to the very end. That's the anomaly. But we also have in both, let's say, transmission lines, the evidence that at least one stanza has not been paraphrased, and there we have only a comment in Sinhalese. And at least in one line of the transmission, we also have a few more comments without a paraphrase, and we have also this note that the sense is clear. which for me is an indication that something has happened there. Either he was ill, he didn't have time, he was bored, whatever, and there was some reason not to complete the text to the very end.
Thank you.
Yeah, and regardless of this, the main point is that if we would assume that this is the work of a plagiator, I can't explain why he would decide in this particular case to proceed like this when he had the Ratnashritika obviously on the table. Yes, he could, of course, he could. I also thought, well, this could be one reason, but comparing all the evidence, this is the most unlikely. Because he does have the notes. Why would he be so?
I don't see why that's determinative as to whether it's authorial reuse or plagiarism.
No, this is just one element in the whole context. It's just one more argument why it is all we know more unlikely that we have to do with the plagiarism, with a plagiator, or with somebody, with a later scholar who has reused. I mean, no matter what word we use for this procedure, but it is simply, in my opinion, unlikely that this was later done by somebody else.
We need to make sure
Yes.
that the microphone is with the question. So so Charlie first, then Alistair, then. So have you finished?
I'm finished.
Okay, and then you go, and then we'll see how we go from this.
Dragomir, I'm not questioning anything of what you're saying. I just want you.
It's on. And don't push button.
Can I ask you to extend your argument? And what you are showing is the similarities between the Purana and the Ratnashritika, but there are places where they're different, and significantly different. And so then the question to just say, what do you do with those differences? Not questioning the similarities at all, but then saying, when we come across places where there are like very striking differences, and then to say, why would Ratnashri, kind of change his comment in ways that, one example, and Yigal may be able to remember best, better than me, there's one place where Ratnashri mentions Samantakuta, Sripada. But the singular Puranasaniya.
It's under the Vyatideka section where the king is said to control. When the king is said to control the entire earth with its mountains and oceans and its islands, Dvipa actually it says, and then Ratnashri in the Ratnashri Tika mentions supplies the Sinhalese examples for all of these, but this does not appear in the Sinhala Sanaya.
Yeah. Well,
so that the Tika takes it as referring to singular Dvipa. The Purana takes it as referring to the 4 continents, and so that's just you would expect in Sri Lanka that you would want to have it as being about singular Dvipa.
Yes. Now the first important question is when you discover such differences, on what basis you're discovering them? You're using an edition of the Kavyadarsa Sanaya, and if yes, you should definitely check the manuscripts, because I showed to you we have a definition of Upendra Vajra, and I was reading it, and it was Kedara Bhatta's definition for sure in the edition. I checked the manuscripts and I read the Jayadeva's definition. So this is a point of difference, and you can never be sure. Is this a contribution of the modern editors, or it is the writing of the author? So in each of these cases where you spot such differences, conspicuous differences in conflicts and problems, I would certainly go to the library and check the manuscripts, because otherwise I cannot be sure how the situation really is. So this will, and without checking this, I'm not now able to discuss such points of detail, because we need to have a look at the primary source.
I accept that, and you're right. I'm hoping you'll give me copies of the manuscripts, so that because they're hard to purchase and so on. But within that, the Vyatideka section is in the section that's not part of the 3rd chapter, and it's hard to speculate on why someone like Dharmananda or any singular editor at that time would want to take away the references to Sri Lanka?
I'll tell you why. Now, we have in the middle somewhere sections where the Copenhagen manuscript is not preserved. Folios are missing. There is a lacuna. That was the reason why I showed you one lacuna. It's definitely a lacuna where the modern editor filled it up with some references which are much, much later. And that's the explanation why in some parts of the edition, of the modern edition, we have something which is absolutely modern. It's based. So please check in all these cases where it agrees with the Kakuta commentary. If it agrees, I bet it was based on them.
Okay, thank you, Dragomir. That was very interesting. Just a short comment, not really a question, but just in agreement to support your view that Ratnasri Jnana did not work in the Rashtrakuta court. Is that it would go against really everything we know about the social history of medieval Pali Buddhism, and that if a monk is that close to the king, right, in terms of his literary activity, he likely will be, if he goes abroad, he will be sent to a ally, to a political sphere which is directly related to the Lankan court, because as far as we're aware, most of these monks who get to a certain level probably are royalty themselves. They are direct relatives with the kings. And so what we see at this period, exactly at this time, is a re-establishment of a connection between Sri Lanka and what is now Orissa. And in Sri Lankan history, we call this the Kalinga Dynasty, in that most of the kings during this period identify themselves actually as Kalinga. Even the ones who in modern Sri Lankan history are said to be the great Sinhala kings. Right, so I'm saying, and as we talked about, we have an article by Sirka, who shows many inscriptional evidence of Rashtrakuta feudatories in Orissa at that time. So it would all tally very nicely that there's much more of a cultural interchange between the northeast and Sri Lanka rather than the Rashtrakuta court. And I think even Sheldon Pollock says that he supposes there may have been a kind of an invasion at some point in which Ratnasri came back to Sri Lanka. But if he's coming with an invading army, there's no way he's going to get into the inner sanctum of the Sri Lankan court and to conduct his scholarly work. He just wouldn't be allowed. But I mean, it's all, it's not exactly specific, but it's more a general point just to support that.
Yeah, I didn't have time to elaborate. There is enough evidence of the Gujarat branch of the Rashtrakutas, and I suspect that when the imperial Rashtrakutas imposed another relatives of theirs in Gujarat, some part of the Rashtrakutas in Gujarat had to go away, and they moved to northern India. And I suspect that these three Rashtrakutas mentioned by Ratnasri are these new Rashtrakutas in the region of Bodh Gaya. And it's quite peculiar. We have a genealogy of only 3 kings, and this cannot be just explained away easily. There is another point in this regard. The Ratnasri Tika does explicitly say at the end in the colophon that the text was completed under the patronage of Tunga during the reign of King Rajapala. So it's clear that Tunga was a vassal of Rajapala. He was somehow below him. And in the case of the Bodh Gaya inscription, Tunga, Dharmavaloka is mentioned. We assume that it's the same. I strongly believe that it's the same guy. And there is also a date in regnal years of a king whose name is partly, unfortunately, damaged in the inscription. But it is actually quite clear that it's not Tunga. So it's the inscription is not dated in his regnal years, but in the regnal years of another king. And it was a Pala king. This is even partly legible. And I assume, and it could be shown because we can just count how many aksharas are missing, and it's only Rajapala whose name fits there. And it's obvious that the inscription was done under the patronage of the same Tunga just 8 years before the Ratnasri Tika was completed. And this goes, of course, against any speculation that Ratnasri may have had some context with Krishna III. And then, of course, the other argument, we have Ratnasri Jnana, and this Sri Jnana is obviously quite clear mark that this monk was active in northern India. We're not aware of any Srijñanas in Lanka. We're not aware of any Srijñanas in South India. The Srijñanas, all of them were in Vikramashila and in Bodh Gaya. There were Garbhas, for example, in Somapura. That's why I mentioned Dipankara Srijñana. When Dipankara Srijñana was still in Somapura, he was Chandragarbha. There was, by the way, another Garbha, a Sinhalese Garbha, Vijaya Garbha, and I think this is Sariputta. At the time when he went for his Fulbright scholarship at the Somapura Mahavihara, and there he completed his Chandralamkara and went back, and he got the name of Sariputta. At that time, we're not aware, actually, in my opinion, of his very first monastic name. Perhaps something Vijaya something, could be, it's a wild speculation. But the Garbhas, that's the main point. The Garbhas were predominantly at Somapura, and the Srijñanas were predominantly at Vikramashila and in Bodh Gaya. And Ratna Srijñana is one of them. So he was the Ratna Mati who became Ratna Srijñana there, and he went back. According to my hypothesis, he received then the name of Upatissa, but this is a long story, and I know that many wouldn't feel inclined to accept this, and they may well ask me, Kim Bodhvam on Mottosi, as indeed Ratna quotes a citizen of Rajagaha who also is addressed with this question with regard to speculation of his. So you're free to ask this question, and I hope that you'll be able soon to read my arguments why I do think that Ratna Mati, who later became Ratna Srijñana, upon his arrival to Lanka, became Upatissa and wrote a number of works, most of them anonymously transmitted, but not all of them. And there's some really remarkable politics which I cannot otherwise explain how they are interrelated in this particular way, including cases of very specific authorial reuse, and it is not the case of, it's not the kind of plagiarism which of course is well attested, and we have it all over in the Sanskrit literature, in the Pali literature. It's not the same kind of reusing the text as Samgarakita and many others have done, especially basing themselves on the text by Ratna, even those which are indubitably by Ratna. So that's another topic which is, of course, will take much more time to discuss.
I'm sorry, but strict timekeeper. We'll just have to save up the other questions for later in this session or for lunchtime. Thank